So, welcome to week 4 of our ethics. Uh, Today's session is going to be um, a decent session. I'm not going to go for any extended periods. And one of the things that we're going to focus on is terminology. And I guess this is one of the fundamental things about ethics is sometimes we can get lost in the terms. Utilitarianism, deontological, hedonism, all that kind of stuff. We can get lost. Consequentialism, relativism. Like there's just, oh my God, there's like terms. The important thing to appreciate is that the terms represent concepts. So really important that you get the concept and then you can match it to the terms. For an example, we'll talk about the ethic of truth, of telling truth. And you've heard people refer to it as veracity. And, like it's like, okay, it's a bigger word than meaning truth. But it's just, I want today's session to be about understanding some kind of embedded concepts. And then we're going to talk about specifically terms that we're going to use going forward. And why does this matter? Is because when you're going to be doing your assignments, assignment 1, assignment 2, well, assignment 1 in particular, and then your summative A, B, and C, it's important that you use the terms because it demonstrates to us that you understand the concepts. So ethical principles in action, we're looking to introduce ethical models. The end of this session, I want you to look at 6 key principles and apply solution-based approach to solving dilemmas. Now, remember what we talked about in terms of ethics and morality. What's the difference? Well, they're very, very similar. Ethics is how you look and understand a situation. Morals is to some degree what you do. And people will talk ethics and morals being the same, but when I want you to think about ethics, think about the discipline of how you look at a situation and how you move towards how you would act. And so here is the big part of the early parts. These are some foundational things that we need to look at. So there's going to be a series of small little videos that we're going to look at and we're going to discuss. Just again, we're talking about anchoring some of our ideas so that when we get into the pure medical ethics part, we're going to be able to understand more. So let me talk about the concept of relativism. Now, relativism, have you ever heard somebody say, well, it's not for me to judge, that people can do whatever they want. It's not for me to judge what's right and what's wrong. So that's relativism. It's all relative to who they are. So we're going to watch a little bit of relativism and we're going to see how that plays out with something like hedonism, which again, it's this idea that as long as you are pursuing what you believe to be right and brings you happiness or takes away pain, it's good. And then we're going to get into consequentialism. Again, these are words, I don't want you to be overwhelmed by the words, but relativism is going to be the concept of that everything is all relative, meaning that it's who are we to judge. Hedonism is it's okay to pursue things that make you happy or that take away your pain. And consequentialism is it's the basis of what the consequences are. You can determine whether or not it's right or not. So let's just jump for the first one. Let me share. Should see. Okay, can everybody see this all right? It says all is not relative. Good.
Yes, bro.
When in Rome, do as the Romans do. We've all heard that advice.
If we're talking about following the age-old Italian practice of eating salad after the main course, doing as the Romans do is fine. But if some present-day Romans want to resurrect the ancient Roman practice of damnatio ad bestias, in which criminals and other deviants were fed to the lions, it would be irrational to follow that cruel practice just because it's what the Romans at one time did.
We used to think that people of different skin colors, specifically African Americans, they didn't have.
One of the things that challenges us as well is that we sometimes judge people. As a matter of fact, sometimes and I'm going to use the term media because I know people use it as a good thing and a bad thing, but let me just use the word media. So we tend to be alarmed and we tend to be excited and we tend to be activated when people criticize somebody. We don't want to be criticized, but we listen to other people criticizing. And so increasingly you see media stories about a politician. We don't like them, they're bad. Well, we like this politician, they're good. And increasingly you're seeing people judging. And that judgment is just human nature, and we are aligned to it. That's why relativism is a hard concept to endorse, because it doesn't really, it's not true. People, when they judge, they judge. And so relativists are saying, well, who am I to judge? Well, in fact, we do that. And that's what makes relativism a little bit difficult. What they spoke about is something called pluralism, and we're going to learn about that a little bit more. And the reason why pluralism matters is because when we get into thinking about medical ethics and about this notion of autonomy, autonomy is one of the most important concepts in medical ethics. It's a pluralistic thinking, and we'll explain that in a minute. So so far, did everybody was able to hear that first video? Okay, good.
Yes, Professor.
Okay. So the next video we're going to watch is something called hedonism, and hedonism, we can sort of know this a little bit because it's about two important ideas. One is I have the right to pursue what I find to make me happy. And I also have the right to pursue the things that take away my pain. Okay.
Hedonism. Hedonism is the belief that pleasure, or the absence of pain, is the most important principle in determining the morality of a potential course of action. Pleasure can be things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but it can also include any intrinsically valuable experience, like reading a good book. Hedonism is a type of consequentialism, and it has several forms. For example, normative hedonism is the idea that pleasure should be people's primary motivation. On the other hand, motivational hedonism says that only pleasure and pain cause people to do what they do. Egotistical hedonism requires a person to consider only his or her own pleasure in making choices. Conversely, altruistic hedonism says that the creation of pleasure for all people is the best way to measure if an action is ethical. Regardless of the type of hedonism, critics fault it as a guide for morality because hedonism ignores all other values, such as freedom or fairness, when evaluating right and wrong.
So hedonism, this idea that the pursuit of good should be permitted. So even people can say you can challenge even those who want to do good deeds, that want to go out and promote something. I'll give you an example. So Bill Gates has a Bill Gates Foundation, and he spends millions of dollars on charitable foundational type stuff. And one of the things that he was strongly supportive of is this idea of vaccinations and immunization in countries like Africa and others. And because of the amount of money that he is spending, because it was his own interest in this particular area, he's been criticized by saying, look, I mean, if you want to give $100 million to help developing areas in Africa, terrific. But shouldn't the people in Africa decide what's the best use of that money in terms of helping people? And so altruistic hedonism is, you can argue, well, what's wrong with that? But here in the case that Bill Gates has decided that, no, I'm going to focus on the thing that I think is important, in this case, vaccinations and immunization for children and young adults. And it's his money, I guess he can make the choice. But it does skew people then into thinking that therefore they can drive the agenda based on what their pet project is. And that's sort of how altruistic hedonism kind of can be sort of a bad thing. It's hard to know. I'm hoping that makes sense. So they mentioned consequentialism. Let's just take a look at consequentialism now.
Consequentialism. Consequentialism is an ethical theory that judges whether or not something is right by what its consequences are. For instance, most people would agree that lying is wrong. But if telling a lie would help save a person's life, consequentialism says it's the right thing to do. Two examples of consequentialism are utilitarianism and hedonism. Utilitarianism judges consequences by a greatest good for the greatest number standard. Hedonism, on the other hand, says something is good if the consequence produces pleasure or avoids pain. Consequentialism is sometimes criticized because it can be difficult or even impossible to know what the result of an action will be ahead of time. Indeed, no one can know the future with certainty. Also, in some situations, consequentialism can lead to decisions that are objectionable, even though the consequences are arguably good. For example, let's suppose economists could prove that the world economy would be stronger and that most people would be happier, healthier, and wealthier if we just enslaved 2% of the population. Although the majority of people would benefit from this idea, most people would never agree to it. However, when judging the idea solely on its results, as classic consequentialism does, then the end justifies the means.
It's a famous expression. Does the ends justify the means? So you think about the discussions that's going on right now in the US around the fact that there's so many vacancies in jobs. And in particular, there are vacancies in restaurant areas and minimum wage opportunities. And so a number of states have said, we're not going to give people unemployment benefits of $300 a week because we'd rather them work. So $300 a month, we'd rather them work because we're disincentivizing. We're basically saying, you don't have to work, it's not important. We'd rather them work. So in the US, in these particular states, the average minimum wage is about $7.25, which isn't a lot. And if you think about in terms of restaurants, I mean, the base minimum wage for many of these restaurants are $2.15, and then you get tips. So I'm not saying that that's enslavement in any way, shape, or form, but what people are saying is that, if 2% of the population should be paid low wages in order for the rest of the population to enjoy the benefits, then what's wrong with that? And that's to some degree consequentialism. So when the states make a decision that they're not going to give unemployment benefits because they would rather people work, you can argue that they're looking at the ends justifying the means. At any time, if anybody has any observations or comments to make, I'd encourage you to do so. This is sort of a, again, base concept piece. Let's look at under utilitarianism, because utilitarianism is some of the foundational pieces of how medical ethics started. We talked about the surgical, this idea that even though you are harming the patient by taking more skin and tissue than is necessary if you're doing cancer surgery, they felt it was the greater good. So this is, we're going to look at utilitarianism in a general concept, but we'll get the idea.
Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. It is a form of consequentialism. Utilitarianism holds that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. It is the only moral framework that can be used to justify military force or war. It is also the most common approach to moral reasoning used in business because of the way in which it accounts for costs and benefits. However, because we cannot predict the future, it's difficult to know with certainty whether the consequences of our actions will be good or bad. This is one of the limitations of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism also has trouble accounting for values such as justice and individual rights. For example, assume a hospital has 4 people whose lives depend upon receiving organ transplants: a heart, lungs, a kidney, and a liver. If a healthy person wanders into the hospital, his organs could be harvested to save 4 lives at the expense of 1 life. This would arguably produce the greatest good for the greatest number, but few would consider it an acceptable course of action, let alone the most ethical one. So, although utilitarianism is arguably the most reason-based approach to determining right and wrong, it has obvious limitations.
And again, we don't want to say that utilitarianism is wrong or right, but you kind of see it a little bit in this idea of vaccinations. We heard, like, for example, there is the AstraZeneca vaccine that caused some people to get strokes and to die. Very, 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 very small number. But as a result, people started saying, oh, I don't want to take the AstraZeneca vaccine. So you'd argue, well, wait a minute now. So the greater good is for all of us to accept the responsibility to take vaccines. But then we know that some people, when they take the vaccine, are going to die because of it. So that's a concept of utilitarianism that you can see play out when it comes to public good, public concept. This idea that I'm going to restrict people's ability to shop, to earn a living on the basis it's going to be the greater good, even though I know that it's going to cause challenge and devastation for some. So you see, public health builds on this idea of utilitarianism. Now, one of the things you'll also learn is that defining what is the greater good is in the eye of the holder. And so this is where you start having a number of people debating what's the bigger harm. Consequentialism would say that because we are getting rid of the variant, because we're getting rid of COVID through vaccinations and through lockdowns, it's justified. Hedonism would say, well, wait a minute, you're impairing my ability to go out to the restaurant. You're impairing my ability to go out and do proper shopping. You're impairing my ability to go and get to go and work. So that's wrong. So you can argue just simply the vaccinations and the stuff that went around purely on the basis of the three concepts that we've just discussed. So again, what's right and what's wrong is really not of the issue. The issue is how do you make arguments and choices and decisions. So let's just look at now what they call the deontological arguments. And this is, we start getting into a little bit more of the medical ideas, but deontological is sort of this idea that the individual has rights within the context of a society.
Deontology. Deontology is an ethical theory that uses rules to distinguish right from wrong. It is often associated with philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that ethical actions follow universal moral laws, such as don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. Deontology is simple to apply. It just requires that people follow the rules and do their duty. This approach tends to fit well with our natural intuition about what is or isn't ethical. Unlike consequentialism, which judges actions by their results, deontology doesn't require weighing the costs and benefits of a situation. This avoids subjectivity and uncertainty because you only have to follow set rules. Despite its strengths, rigidly following deontology can produce results that many people find unacceptable. For example, suppose you're a software engineer and learn that a nuclear missile is about to launch that might start a war. You can hack the network and cancel the launch, but it's against your professional code of ethics to break into any software system without permission. And it's a form of lying and cheating. Deontology advises not to violate these rules. However, in letting the missile launch, thousands of people will die. So, following the rules makes deontology easy to apply. But it also means disregarding the possible consequences of our actions when determining what is right and what is wrong.
So then how do this, so how do we sort of reconcile what we've seen so far? Well, think about the gentleman, the person who shaved off his beard so that he could be a physician during COVID. So the deontological ethics would look at it and say, the steadfast rule was service to others. The steadfast rule in this case was the keeping of the facial hair. That's the rule. So we would argue that if keeping the facial hair was a rule, he would then continue to follow it. As we've talked about ethics being how you make choices when you have competing demands. So you can argue the deontological approach that if the gentleman made the decision that he was going to keep his facial hair, you couldn't criticize it because he was following what he believed to be the rules and the right. The consequentialism would sort of say, well, but wait a minute, because he was able to shave off his beard, he was able to help people. And isn't helping people altruistic hedonism? Isn't it kind of, he would feel better about it. So you can see how these different things would play into the decision that somebody would have to make about the beard. Now, again, sadly and frustratingly, he was put into that position because the institutions didn't have the proper facial, the masks for people who had facial hair. And we're not going to argue on that basis. We're not going to look at that, although you can argue that it had some play in this, but let's just set that aside for a minute and say, well, how did the person consider this stuff? How did they consider You know, you could argue that the relativism could be, who am I to sort of say that it's your choice to wear facial hair or not, and here's here are the masks that we have. If you choose to have facial hair, then you choose not to wear the mask. So that's relativism. Who am I to judge whether it's important to you or not? Hedonism, consequentialism, utilitarianism. The physician would argue the reason I shaved the beard off because I could do more good. It's utilitarianism, that sacrificing my own sense of right and wrong so that I can serve the greater good mattered to him more, the utilitarian approach. And so it overrode to some degree his deontological rule following. Does that make sense? How when you look at choices you make. Now, again, people would say, oh, well, why are you making this so complicated by using this terminology and stuff? And I'm not trying to make it complicated. I'm just trying to see that when you have a couple people that are having a discussion as what's right and what's wrong, you can either yell at each other and convince people on the basis of volume that you're right, or you can try to use logic and reasoning. So what I'm talking about is some of the reasons why people would choose certain things and they'd feel that the way in which they're looking at something was morally right. Okay. And the reason why this matters is because when we look at medical ethics in whether it's you're a nurse, whether you're a physician, you're a dentist, when you look at the choices that you have to make as a professional and the autonomy that an individual has to make the choices that they deem to be right for themselves, they're going to come in conflict. And so you're going to need to think about how you view the world and how you see things, and then reconcile in your mind how you're going to be able to do the best that you can for the patient, respecting both your individual professional ethics as well as their choices. So relativism, hedonism, consequentialism, utilitarian, deontological. And again, I'm not trying to overwhelm you with terms, but I just want you to understand the concepts. Every one of these, like, would say that, you know, you could hear people when they argue a point or where they make a point, you could see everyone kind of uses different types, and that doesn't make them wrong. Let's talk about something called moral pluralism, which is a kind of a combination of all of these and will allow you to kind of work things through.
Moral pluralism. Moral pluralism is the idea that there can be conflicting moral views that are each worthy of respect. Moral pluralists tend to be open-minded when faced with competing viewpoints. They analyze issues from several moral points of view before deciding and taking action. Moral pluralists believe that many moral issues are extremely complicated. Thus, no single philosophical approach will always provide all the answers. For example, assume a building is on fire. A woman has the opportunity to rush inside and save the children trapped in the burning building. But in doing this, she may die and leave her own child an orphan. A moral pluralist would conclude that there is no definitive way to decide which is the better course of moral action. Indeed, moral pluralism declares that it is sometimes difficult to choose between competing values. So, moral pluralism occupies a sensible middle ground between there is only one right answer, as moral absolutism says, and there is no wrong answer, as moral relativism claims.
So that's moral pluralism. And so just these are the baseline concepts. And I think moral pluralism kind of is where a lot of people would say that is, I don't want to call it the middle of the road ethics, but it's the kind of idea that then drives the next series of discussions, which specifically uh, about what we look at in terms of medical ethics. So what we have seen so far is the discussion about ethics per se and about the different ways. And let me just talk some specific concepts now. So let me share my screen again. So we looked at relativism, hedonism, we looked at consequentialism, we looked at utilitarianism, deontological, and moral pluralism. So let's sort of look now at the 6 key principles. And here's just a simple cartoon by a Canadian author Canadian comic from many, many, many years ago, but his name, he writes this everyman called Herman. And what it says here is, Joyce, how much do I charge when I don't know what's wrong with them? I always thought that's kind of a funny statement. So the first key principle in medical ethics is beneficence, then non-malfeasance, autonomy, equity, dignity, and truth. Okay, so those are the really important things. I'm going to say that autonomy is probably the top, beneficence, non-maleficence, and then truth are those sort of the top. Dignity and equity, people would argue that dignity and equity are things that are both medical as well as outside, but this idea of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and equity. And I'm going to show you another video where a dentist is going to explain these concepts in a little bit more detail.
This video will review the 5 ethical principles in detail. The first 2 principles are beneficence, from the Latin meaning do good, and non-maleficence, from the Latin meaning do not do bad, or do no harm. Are they different, or are they just 2 sides of the same coin? Well, the ADA lists them separately, so I will do the same. Beneficence involves promoting good. This could include proper diagnosis and proper treatment plan presentation. Violations could include failure to diagnose or failure to treat, not promoting the best treatment, or patient abandonment. Non-maleficence involves not hurting someone. This includes appropriate treatment and execution of that treatment. Violations could include unnecessary care or aggressive care, incompetent treatment, and not referring when indicated. The next principle is autonomy, respect for others' choices. From the Greek words auto, meaning one's own, and nomos, meaning rule, principle, or law, autonomy means allowing others to make their own choices. Studies have shown that capable people benefit from making their own health decisions, and that making their own decisions gives patients satisfaction. This principle is thought to be the most important of the 5 principles by far. Here is probably the most controversial question in all of medical ethics. Is it ever appropriate to interfere with a patient's autonomy?
So pause that just for a second to again ask that question, because you can say, well, shouldn't a patient have the right to make their own choices? And even if the choices is wrong, shouldn't I as a physician, if the patient came in and asked me to do things that I didn't think was ethical, should I still do it? So what is a patient autonomy? The ability to determine what's right for themselves.
This woman in her 40s wants all her maxillary teeth extracted. There's nothing wrong with her teeth or the supporting structures. We will talk in class this week about what
So what he's editing this video down, but what he's saying is that if a patient came in and said to you, I want all my teeth taken out, and you're a dentist, would you do it? If you respect the patient's autonomy, the answer is yes. But if you respected the fact that you have your own right to make moral pluralism, you could say, I'm not going to do it. Or you can say the consequence of taking all your teeth out is down the road, it's going to be harder, so I'm not going to do it. So you can see how the principle of autonomy, in other words, the patient's ability to make their own choices and ask you to do it, matters.
Answering yes to the question, is it ever appropriate to interfere with a patient's autonomy, is called paternalism. Interfering with the autonomy of a patient who is about to harm themselves, like the woman in the previous scenario. Whether or not paternalism is acceptable is debated among experts in ethics. Should we refuse to let patients make bad healthcare decisions, or do we let them make those bad healthcare decisions? That is a huge question, and we will start talking about it this week. The next principle is veracity. Coming from the Latin word meaning truth, it means honesty. There are two kinds of veracity violations: dishonesty, also known as a lie, and willfully omitting something. Not telling the whole truth is really also a lie. Making a decision depends on knowing the truth. Both parties have the right to choose, both the patient and the dentist. And both parties must tell the truth. The dentist has to give the patient the whole truth, and the patient has to tell the dentist everything. So, while we are talking about honesty, is it ever advisable to admit you made a mistake or apologize to a patient? Like, what if you treat the wrong tooth? You saw this in a previous video. Choosing to behave ethically can involve risk, some penalties, or some sacrifice. Telling the patient the truth is the right thing to do. The last principle is justice or fairness, which involves treating all patients in the same way without any bias. This would include emergency patients, making sure that they are treated in a timely fashion as you would for all of your patients, people with disabilities, and people who have access to care issues, so treating Medicaid patients the same as you would the rest of your patients. And finally, charity. We all have to look out for those who have no way to pay us. Some people add a sixth principle, fidelity. This mostly relates to keeping the patient's medical information confidential, so we will not be discussing fidelity as an ethical principle. So those are the 5 principles, and we will explore them further with cases in class this week.
So fidelity is interesting because we know patient confidentiality is something that matters to a lot of people. And I'm going to sort of just jump in and sort of say the idea of patient confidentiality. I mean, there are now our laws. Remember we talked about the fact that laws and ethics sometimes are different. Laws are the minimum, ethics are sort of a kind of a higher level thing. But patient confidentiality is now governed by law. Fidelity also means to bring your proper self to, in other words, you have the credentials and the skills. You're not going to undertake things that you don't know how to do. So these are the kind of idea. Fidelity is a big concept. And it's not necessarily put in as what we're going to study as being an ethical concept, because a lot of times fidelity matters. And let's sort of talk about this idea of, for example, you'll learn about patient consent. So when you go to the emergency department and you're unconscious, you don't have the ability to consent. And so in theory, if a doctor operates on you or does something, that's assault, right? Because you haven't given a consent, but there are some things that are a little bit more than just that notion. So let me go back to where we are at in terms of our scoreboard. So beneficence, non-maleficence, you sometimes say malfeasance, it's autonomy, equity, dignity, truth. So let's talk about beneficence. So everybody has a duty to advance the good of others, if it's possible to do so without undue risk to oneself, where the nature of the good is in keeping with the competently held values of the recipient of the action in question. They're all embedded ideas. But you think about, what does undue influence to oneself? So, for example, if you are a physician and you are going to study infectious diseases, and the persons that you're going to treat has an infectious disease of unknown origin, or you don't know what it is, can you say, I'm not going in to treat that patient because I don't know whether I'm going to harm myself or not? Is that fair? Can you refuse to give treatment because you think it's going to cause risk to yourself? Can you think of a real example of this principle?
Yeah, coronavirus. Like when the coronavirus started, I saw in India like many hospitals not accepting, not treating the coronavirus patient. Only the government hospital treat the coronavirus patients.
So some people were mad, and some people said, okay, that's justified. Well, that's the concept that's illustrated. Thank you for that, Rajat, because it's a really good example. Because you can look at the hospital and say, well, wait a minute now, what do you mean you're not treating these people? And you can argue that from a utilitarian approach, if the patient comes into my hospital and infects everybody, then that's harm, right? So it's a really interesting idea around beneficence. Everybody has a duty to prevent harm to others, insofar as it must possible for others, okay? Whereas the nature of the harm is in keeping with the competent values. The key here is without undue risk to themselves. Let's just jump quickly into autonomy. The quality of state of being self-governing, self-directing, freedom, and especially moral independence. What does this mean? We're going to go back to the malfeasance in a moment. Well, we're going to study consent. We're going to study the right of people to make their own choices and decisions. So if you are a physician and you are morally opposed to abortion, nobody's going to ask you to do an abortion. But do you have a responsibility of making sure that the patients are aware that they can have an abortion? And what physicians will allow you to do that? So you're starting to sort of see how these things play out. So an individual has the right to make choices about themselves, about their bodies. You could sort of say, well, that's hedonism, that's deontological, that's just the way. But the argument here is that autonomy becomes one of the most prized thing, both for the physician, or in this case, the healthcare provider, but also for the patient. And can you think of an example? I gave you one about abortion, but Can you think of another example? You guys study this a little bit about MAID, medically assisted dying.
Yes, Professor.
So there is some discussions here about, the principle here is, if a person has an incurable illness, they're in great pain, they're competent of sound mind and body, they can make their own decisions. Okay. But now that there's a group of people who say, look, I have a mental illness and I hate it and it's debilitating and distracting, and I should have the right to, if it's a chronic illness, I should have the right to ask that my life be ended. And people are saying, but wait a minute, is mental health issues that are not going to cause you to die per se, not ending life, but it's going to cause you suffering for a long time. Should you have the right to come in and say, this is what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to kill me? And so some would say, on the principle of autonomy, is I should have the right. But then if you're a physician, you could say, that's not, that's not something I'm prepared to do. The reason I raise this is because there's, the idea that people say, well, it's a violation of my charter rights and freedoms of independence. If you basically say that I have to be terminally ill and great pain and not likely to get better before you're allowed to take my life. And people are saying, well, wait a minute now, that's just, that's arbitrary. Why does it have to be terminal? Because everybody is going to die. Everybody's got a terminal illness, aging. So there again, what do we think about? What do we think about it? Let's look at equity. We saw justice, natural laws are right, freedom from bias or favoritism. We've seen justice before in a previous video, so we're not going to go into great depth about this. But what is right? Who makes that decision about what's right? It's again a great question, isn't it? So before we go through the dignity and others, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and then we're going to finish. We've got about 20 minutes left. So hoping that when people come back, we're going to be able to wrap this up. Your homework is going to be to go and read the chapter 1 of the book, in particular to just look at these things in more detail. What I'm trying to do today is to introduce the ideas, introduce the concepts, because we're going to be using these terms going forward. What I want you to do is to understand the concepts and to explore them as much as anything. So I'm going to stop the share here. I'm going to say that we're going to come back at just about 20 after. Okay, so let's just sort of quickly review where we're at. So what we've talked about is, we've talked about the principle of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, equity, dignity, truth. And so the first one we had is beneficence, which we're talking about doing good to others. So the definition is advancing the good of others if you're possible to do so without undue risk to yourself. So advance the good of others. Non-maleficence is preventing harm to others. But I'm highlighting this undue risk to oneself because that's an embedded concept where I think we're going to explore this further down the road. We talked about autonomy, what autonomy means, what it doesn't mean. We're going to talk more about this when we think about the idea of consent, the idea of substitute decision makers, about when it's appropriate for a physician or a dentist or a nurse to override the patient's interests. And there's a fundamental difference here, and where it's I don't know, we're going to illustrate the concept further, but there's a difference between offering a patient a choice and offering a patient the choice that they can consider and weigh back and forth. I can sort of say I can give you a choice of either getting hammer your big toe or punch you in the nose. That's you can make a choice, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right choice or there's the right availability. And some people just simply don't have sometimes the capacity or awareness to be able to make those choices. So at what point do you say, I'm going to override your autonomy to make choices? And again, it's a very interesting subject to deal with. Equity. We talked about justice. And in particular, we talked about a video for justice. And I'm going to cue this up because I think it's worth showing again so we can talk about different types of justice. Because again, it's important to understand what we're talking about. So here is justice.
Justice, for many people, refers to fairness. But while justice is important to almost everyone, it means different things to different groups. For instance, social justice is the notion that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social opportunities, irrespective of race, gender, or religion. Distributive justice refers to the equitable allocation of assets in society. Environmental justice is the fair treatment of all people with regard to environmental burdens and benefits. Restorative or corrective justice seeks to make whole those who have suffered unfairly. Retributive justice seeks to punish wrongdoers objectively and proportionately. And procedural justice refers to implementing legal decisions in accordance with fair and unbiased processes. Justice is one of the most important moral values in the spheres of law and politics. Legal and political systems that maintain law and order are desirable, but they cannot accomplish either unless they also achieve justice.
So that's justice. And so you guys have seen that before. So again, just to sort of highlight where we're at in learning about these concepts and terms. So we will see in situations where what we think is fair may not necessarily be fair, and what we think is right may not be right. I was reading a series of articles about the ethics committees that are usually involved at hospitals. And a lot of times these decisions are predicated on the idea that somebody has made a medical error. And they come to the ethics committee to say whether or not they have the responsibility to tell the patient what's going on. And usually they will look at it from a risk management perspective, and they will say, well, wait a minute now, if we tell the patient that we harmed them and we're full disclosure, then we open ourselves up to lawsuits, in which case I can argue that it's going to render us harm beyond what we can really afford, because we're going to get sued and we're going to lose all our money, and then we're not going to be able to practice. Or they're going to go to the medical college and they're going to report us and we could lose our license, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard. Justice is hard because we talk about, what's right, what's fair. We play a lot of different things against each other. So reinforcing ethics isn't simply about morality. Ethics is about looking at the issue from different contexts and different perspectives. In the end of the day, who you are as a person, who you are as your character, That matters. And so the point of learning about ethics isn't to learn what's right. It's how you examine the situation and default to what is right for you, what's right for the patient, what's right for the situation. And again, it's so difficult to determine. I mean, there's no true rule either way. But if you think about our moral pluralism, how there are certain things that just feel righter than the other, if I can use that terminology. So I've used a couple examples of justice, right, freedom from favoritism. So this idea that, for example, if you come to my hospital and you are a drug addict or an abuser, do I have the responsibility of treating you? There have been many examples of, a patient that has come in with a gunshot wound, knowing full well that they've been shot by police in the process of committing a really bad crime. And there are some people who say they purposely don't give anesthesia to the patient because they want them to suffer, they want them to feel pain. Is that equity? Is that freedom from bias or favoritism? No, but it happens. Dignity. So dignity means to allow people to be who they are and exist who they are. So for example, one of the most important things to realize about ethics is that they've evolved. So it used to be that there were things that people had done in their past life that was considered to be wrong. And physicians would therefore say, I'm not going to treat you because I don't like the way who you are. Say, for example, you had HIV and you were homosexual. People said, I'm not going to do it because that's a choice. But if you were a baby that got HIV because you were born to a mom with HIV, then we're okay. We can treat that. We feel the baby didn't cause it to themselves. So every person, in theory, should have the right to dignity, to feel worthy, honored, and esteemed. But going back to relativism, we judge. And so the part of it is to figure out where your bias comes in, where your judgment comes in, and to determine whether or not you are honoring the person as being worthy, honored, and esteemed enough that you could do and bring your best professional representation to the situation. Lastly, truth. And truth, and we talked about veracity, we talked about fidelity. Fidelity is a big word. And that's from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Fidelity is a really important concept, which is if you are a physician and you are not in the position to be able to operate, in other words, you're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or you've had no sleep, or you're feeling really sad about something, and you don't think you could fully concentrate, then you need to look at this to say whether or not you ought to then do the work. Fidelity means to bring your best to a situation. It also means that if it's beyond your capability, that you ought to bring in expertise. And it doesn't necessarily, you may feel embarrassed to have to go to a colleague who is maybe your rival, but somebody who's better, but you have to kind of bring that level of truth to the situation as much as possible. And you're going to read about this a little later. Now, we're going to watch a video from Stephen Covey. It's part of the part of our course content, so I'm going to show it to you. It's a little bit longer. First, however, I'm going to show you this video from the Emperor of All Maladies. And the reason I'm showing you this video, because it's more of a healthcare background piece. Stephen Covey is going to be about the role of character in how we make decisions, but I want to show you this breast cancer one, because I've talked about it a number of times, about it, how it used to be that we did things a certain way when a woman had breast cancer, to the point where we changed the approach. And you can look at the paternalism and I know best because I'm the physician approach, and the issue of lack of consent, the lack of autonomy and stuff. And you could say, oh, that's bad. But that's the way things were, and we've evolved. And so that's why I'm going to show you this particular video.
Several years ago, a young oncologist named Siddhartha.
And it's going to be, it's going to talk about the author of this Emperor of All Maladies. I really like the book. It's a very interesting book, but we're going to go start from here. If you ever get a chance to listen to him talk, Siddhartha Mukherjee, very, very well spoken, very interesting presenter. And the reason I showed that particular video as opposed to the Stephen Covey video is I wanted to talk about how it reinforces some of the key concepts that we've been talking about. And I'm going to share my screen back to the original, back to our video, and we're going to back to our sort of a slide deck, and we're going to be able to look at it again. So we talked about, so the role of a physician is to advance the good of others if it's possible to do so with undue risk to oneself. So if I am a surgeon and I have been taught that radical mastectomy is the way to go, because that's what Halsted talked about, that was 100 years ago, and it's okay for then, it's okay for now. It's the competently held values of me. But what he's talking about is that where women were going into the operating theater not knowing whether or not they're going to have their breast removed. And it was up to the physician themselves, or him or herself, to make the decision. And so where was the autonomy here? It wasn't. Where was the idea of providing consent? It wasn't. So this idea you were going to look at the tumor, if it's just simply a lump because it's a lump, then we're going to take it out. If it's cancer, the whole breast goes. And I thought, you know, the physicians are saying, I'm doing good. That's what I've been trained to do. I'm doing good. But then you ask the question is it doing harm? In other words, is it protecting? Now, if I said, so this particular physician said, you know what? I'm not finding it to be any more successful. So why is it that we don't look at the concept of lumpectomy? Isn't that the lesser of the harm here? Why not prevent? So suddenly you've got the two. The issue is about what undue risk is to oneself. So this physician, he was lambasted. He was like going against conventional medicine. He said, however, let's look at it from a scientific and data perspective, but he was vilified. So you can argue, well, why would he go against the medical establishment? It's, you know, they're a big, powerful lobby group. Why would I do that? Because women were telling him, that's not what I wanted. I do not want just simply to go into an operating room theater and not knowing if I'm going to come out and have a breast or not. And I want you to do a better job in telling me what my best options are. I want there to be truth here, not just simply paternalism. I want the autonomy to be self-governing, self-directing, and have independence. So I want that to be a choice. Even if you tell me that I have cancer in the breast, I ought to decide whether or not I want to have my breast removed, even if it's going to shorten my life. That's my choice. Okay? So everybody ought to be biased from favoritism. So their argument is if you were a man and you went into the hospital and you had testicular cancer, then you're not just simply going to have you're not going to have that procedure done unless people explain. But somehow, because it was women, we had that right to make the choice for them. So there was bias, favoritism. I am the surgeon. I know what's best for you. And it wasn't until women started coming up and saying, I don't want this. I have the right to make these choices. Then you started looking at the concept of equity. And so when the physician decided that they were going to do a comparison of radical mastectomy to lumpectomy, the other physicians wouldn't send their data, they wouldn't send their patients. Because I believe that I'm doing right and doing good because that's the way I was taught. I believe you're doing harm, so I'm not going to do it. I can justify it from my professional ethics. But it wasn't until when the women found out about it that there was choice. They were the ones that drove people to be referred to this study. And they were given the dignity. The patient suddenly got the dignity to be worthy, to be honored and esteemed. The patient had the choice. I'm going to my doctor and I said, "Doctor, I'd like to be referred to the lumpectomy study." And they said, "Well, no, I don't agree with it. It's not right." Doesn't matter. That's what dignity means. And truth. Fidelity says that if you are a physician and you're willing to do a treatment, you ought to show that the treatment that you're giving works. So the fact that people were not prepared to participate, physicians were not prepared to participate in a lumpectomy study because they did not believe it to be true, even though there was no data to say that it was going to cause harm, it wasn't really true. It wasn't their fidelity. In other words, the physicians are saying even though lumpectomy was just as effective, they didn't want to. Granted, I mean, the data wasn't there, but listen, think about the fact that they didn't know enough about cancer. They didn't know enough about phenotyping the cancer to say that some of them had already left the body. They just assumed it was a stain that they didn't know this stuff. And that's the fascinating part about the Emperor of All Maladies, is the fact that we learn to do a lot of really hard stuff on experimentation. There was a very heartbreaking chapter about how we learned so much about chemotherapy drugs because we gave them to children in Boston hospitals who were terminal, and we just inflicted these poisons on the kids knowing full well that they would cause harm to them. But because the utilitarian approach said that we ought to do this, we did it. We didn't get their consent, we just did it. But as a result of that, we now know so much more about treating with chemotherapy. It's messy. Life is messy when it comes to this kind of stuff. So that was the Emperor of All Maladies. I have another video here which talks a little bit about the book, The Emperor of All Maladies. It's very interesting. We're not going to watch it. I'm going to also encourage you to watch the Stephen Covey video. This is about character. This is a little bit more. Stephen Covey wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Effective People. And what he did is he studied who were effective and who weren't in business and made a determination that the person's character mattered the most. So I think it's worth seeing on your own. It's a kind of an old video. It's kind of specific too, but I don't, it reinforces this idea that your character matters. And so goes back to the idea of what's the correct morality. But I showed the Emperor of All Maladies because it illustrated and highlighted the concepts of medical ethics that now play forward. So what's next? So I want you to read chapter 1. In particular, I mean, I have the book here, right? In particular, of chapter 1, the first part of it is kind of hard to get through because it's a lot of yada yada. They will talk a little bit about utilitarianism, the principle of utility, what's fair for some, what's fair for others, as well as deontological theories. So it's part of the chapter. But the ethical principles in healthcare, starting on page 20, which is the autonomy, equity and justice, fidelity, beneficence and non-malfeasance and non-maleficence, are the things to look at. So I want you to read chapter 1, and then I want you to reread it. And what I'd like you to do is the 6 medical principles you see. I want you to think of an example in your life that you've seen where one or more of these medical principles came into being. And the reason I'm asking you to do this ahead of time is because you're going to choose one of them and you're going to write about it. And when you write about it, you're going to need to use the terms. Okay? So next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about assignment 1, but that's where we're at. And that's today's session. So are there any questions that I can refer to or I can address? Slight technical issues. There's a place where I'm at is they're busy doing some work, and so they're cutting the power and they're making noise in the background. So I'm like distracted a little bit here, but I will post the video as well, post the lecture so you can go back and look at it. But today's session, the week 4, introduces some really important concepts: utilitarian, deontological, consequentialism, moral pluralism, relativism. They're all these isms. But then think about it from the idea of your responsibility as a healthcare provider is to do good, to not cause harm, to be honest and truthful, to treat people fairly, to give them the autonomy that is necessary, including the ability to make choices. So those ideas are going to anchor what we have going forward. And we're going to be talking about specific components like consent, substitute decision making, things that will matter. So are there any questions? Was it a lot to go through today? And just so for my own, do the videos help? Like the short little 1 and 2 minute videos, do they help?
Yes, Professor.
Yes, Professor.
I show the videos, even though they're from a business program in the US. I show the videos for 2 reasons. One, I think they explain the concepts relatively well in a short period of time, but also it gives you an opportunity to hear from students like yourselves. People are in college and university to sort of reinforce this stuff. Going forward, we're going to be spending more time as a group talking amongst ourselves and with ourselves about these concepts so we can explore them in great depths. But weeks 1 to 4 was really about anchoring the components that we'll then use going forward. And what I'm going to invite you to do is that when we talk about topics, is to try to have you introduce the concepts and maybe introduce the terms, but the concepts are the ones that are really important. And you can be a moral pluralist, you could be a utilitarian, you could be a deontological expert. The point here isn't there isn't one way. But what ethics allows you to do is when things compete is to place in context. And ultimately, as a healthcare provider, your job is to work with the patient, to allow the patient to have the ultimate authority and ultimate responsibility for making choices that are meaningful and valuable. And that you as a patient, because we're all going to be patients, would probably want that just as much. We want our physicians, we want our dentists, we want our pharmacists, we want our nurses to be competent. We want them to be trustworthy. We want them to be fair. But we also want them to respect what we want. Anyway, so again, that's today's session. Thank you for hanging in. And I will wish you a good week, Call, and we will see you again next week. I'm going to allow the last hour of our session for you guys to go and pull your textbook up, whether electronic or not, and to read the stuff, and to think about the 6 principles, and to think about examples, okay? Because that's your homework. And it will matter for assignment 1. So without any further questions, I will bid you adieu, and hopefully you'll have a good week, the rest of the week.
Thank you, Professor.